Hey, welcome back to the End of History in our podcast series, The 6 Years That Made the Modern Middle East. I'm JB Shreve, and today's episode, it's an exciting one. I think I hope it will reshape a lot of your perspectives regarding this region of the world. This will give you an informed perspective, one shaped by facts rather than assumptions. This particular year, 1979, that we're going to look at today in this episode, is where a lot of the assumptions start coming into play at, and we need to separate some fact from fiction. Now, if you're not a Patreon supporter of our podcast, I encourage you to sign up for that today. You can access all sorts of prior podcast series, including several on the history of the Middle East, but also some on economic inequality, on the history of India, history of the religious right, all sorts of podcast series out there that we've produced over the course of the last 12 years. So you can get those when you become a Patreon supporter. You can find out more about that at theendofhistory.net. Also, be sure to visit the show notes for this episode today. If you want to go deeper on any of these topics, there's several really good books I would recommend you get hold of and read about the topics that we're going to take some deep dives into today. But if you want to go deeper, I think if you're hungry for knowledge, you're going to want to go deeper. So grab these books that I recommend there. I think that's going to do it. Let's go ahead and jump into today's podcast episode, 1979, one of the 6 years that helped shape the modern Middle East.
The President and the Shah met for about an hour this morning. The President said the Shah's visit was encouraging and had strengthened the strong ties of friendship between the two countries.
Despite the temporary imposition of martial law, the Shah's new government appears determined to press ahead with liberal reform. It is from the mosques that opposition to the Shah is being led by puritanical Shiite Muslims. The religious zealots want to return to the Constitution of 1906, which would ensure all legislation conforms with Islamic law.
Almost 40,000 refinery workers went on strike today, virtually cutting off Iran's petroleum exports.
University students demonstrating in Tehran, shouting death to the Shah, pledge allegiance to the Islamic movement of the Ayatollahs.
The number killed in Tehran since the beginning of the month is probably well over 100. But people in this crowd were saying and believing 7,000 had been killed. Emotions over the dead and the rumors of dead are high. Every day here now, the demonstrations and arrests go on. Rumors in Tehran say people are being armed and may soon start firing back at the troops.
News there would be some kind of announcement about a new government came after yet another day of running confrontations in the center of Tehran. The army kept moving today, trying to head off the demonstrations, keep them where possible from growing in size. This dogged military resistance to the anti-Shah disturbances, part of an effort to buy the Shah as much time as possible in which to create a political solution. Demonstrations like these today in Tehran are a daily occurrence in towns throughout the country now, and one sign of the fact there is nothing less than a kind of revolution being attempted here, trying to change the form of Iran's government, and unlikely to settle easily for any solution which still keeps the Shah on his throne.
Daily, it has become more difficult to look at the scope of opposition to the Shah of Iran and still see his monarchy surviving. The Ayatollahs are committed to the ouster of the Shah and nothing less than that. They chant, Makba Shah, death to the Shah.
The new prime minister has gone some liberal political distance beyond the Shah, but not likely far enough to suit the anti-Shah religious establishment or members of the political opposition.
The Shah and his empress left shortly before midday. The empire he had hoped to build had been shattered by a year of violence.
The news spread with the speed of the human shout. Shah Farari Shodeh, the people cried, the Shah has escaped. The old chant of death to the Shah was replaced today by a new one, death to Carter. There is still a strong sentiment against American interests in Iran and the widespread belief that the United States has taken the profits from Iranian oil. Khomeini, Khomeini, they cried, we're waiting for you. The Ayatollah is expected to return to Iran, but when or how is not yet known.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So in our last episode, we looked at 1967. We saw how the 6 Days War reshaped the modern Middle East. A lot of terms and positions that we're familiar with today, they really took shape in 1967. Terms like the occupied territories, settlements, even the hardline alliance between Israel and the U.S., all of that began to be really formed, really take formation in 1967. Now, as we come to 1979, this fourth year that helped shape the modern Middle East as we know it today, so much was formed in that particular year. It's truly difficult to break through for many listeners so that they realize how different things were before 1979 compared to what came afterwards. This is the year, 1979, when the Middle East turned to extremist Islam. Not everyone, not in total, but this is the year when politics finally failed, and many of the movers, the shakers in the region, they gave up and they turned to extremism. Before 1979, whenever you hear about terrorism in or from the Middle East, it's always political terrorism. After 1979, that changes. Before 1979, you have guys like Nasser, Sadat, guys who were the major players in the Middle East. After 1979, you hear names like Khomeini and, of course, bin Laden. Well, in this episode, I want to track down how these changes came about and also why. What shifted in the Middle East between 1967 and 1979 that transitioned the people of this region to largely give up on politics. Now, we have to start with the Palestinians, of course. Remember, as I've said in the last 2 episodes, this story of the Middle East is not the story of Israel and Palestine. A lot of people see it that way, but that's just not correct. Nevertheless, the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians, it really does loom large in the minds of many within the Middle East. A lot of that's by design. Many Arab leaders went out of their way after 1948 to paint Israel as the boogeyman of imperialism. It was the evidence, Israel was, of all that was wrong with the world and how terribly the great powers had treated the people of this region of the world. They talked this up continually. The Arab leaders did. A lot of Arab leaders did. There was some germ of truth to it, obviously, but it really went beyond that. It went beyond what the germ of truth was. Rather than building strong states and stable governments, Israel became the scapegoat for everything in the eyes of the Arab leaders. Well, that image only worsened after 1967, as Israel easily conquered the invading neighbors of Syria, Jordan, Egypt. Israel humiliated the so-called great powers of the Middle East. These Arab states could either take their licks, they could learn from their mistakes, or they could ramp up the blame game against Israel, and they chose the latter. Israel was now, after 1967, officially an occupying power, having taken Gaza, the West Bank, the Golan Heights from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, respectively. So the Palestinians were the mascot for the Arab world of Israel's imperialism. Here's the evidence, they would say. They had been dislocated, the Palestinians had, many of them twice, both in 1948 and in 1967. So the Palestinians had no homeland. Arab support of the Palestinians became the stand-in for real opposition to Israel by this point. They couldn't defeat Israel, so the Palestinians would be their trophy of sorts, a trophy of victimization before the world for all to see. This is evidence of the injustice enacted by Israel and the Western world. After 1967, things shifted radically for the Palestinians themselves. They became more than just a puppet for Nasser and the Egyptians after this. This was basically what they were, what the Palestinian political organizations amounted to prior to 1967. But after that overwhelming defeat of Egypt in the 6 Days War, it's not going to be business as usual anymore. The Palestinians began to take matters into their own hands, and those hands were largely the hands of a man by the name of Yasser Arafat. Now, Arafat was probably born in Egypt in 1929. And I say probably because it's not certain exactly where he was born. Some say he was born in Jerusalem. That's probably more apocryphal than anything else. Both his parents were Palestinians, however. His mother's family hailed from Jerusalem. He founded the Palestinian resistance group Fatah around 1959. Now, the name Fatah is a reverse acronym in Arabic that translates to the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. Prior to the 6 Days War, Arafat and Fatah conducted a lot of guerrilla raids into Israel, but his and the organization's activity was always somewhat restrained, and it was restrained by Nasser in Egypt, Nasser's influence. After the war, after 1967, however, Arafat grew in influence. He grew in power, not only over Fatah, but the collection of Palestinian organizations sponsored by different Middle East powers. The influence of Nasser had been highly tarnished by the failed war, and increasingly it was believed that the Palestinians, they had to fight their battles for themselves now. If there was ever going to be any real hope for a homeland, they had to fight for themselves. Now, this was the time period when the Israeli Prime Minister, the new Israeli Prime Minister, Golda Meir, she made her famous statement that there's no such thing as a Palestinian. A real racist statement, by the way. There's no such thing as a Palestinian, is what she said. Now, that's a bogus statement, rooted to politics, not to historical facts. She was suggesting that there was no Palestinian national identity before the state of Israel. Well, that wasn't true. In 1968, following a growing number of incursions and attacks from Arafat's group on Israel, the Israelis launched an attack of their own upon Arafat's headquarters in the town of Karamah. This became a famous event in the life of Arafat and the story of Palestinian resistance, really a thing of legends. The leaders of several other Palestinian groups, they withdrew on news of these Israeli advances and invasion, but Arafat held firm. He reportedly said, and this is a quote, "We want to convince the world that there are those in the Arab world who will not withdraw or flee." Now, those words, of course, were particularly damning toward the Arab armies who had been so roundly defeated in the 6 Days War just a year earlier. Palestinian resistance at the Battle of Karamah was shockingly strong. They didn't win the fight, but they inflicted far more casualties on the Israeli forces than anyone had imagined was possible. So it was a moral victory of sorts. For the first time that anyone could remember, the Arabs, particularly the Palestinians and Arafat, had stood up for themselves and resisted the Israeli military. Arafat was featured on the cover of Time magazine after that battle and effectively became the figurehead for Palestinian resistance for the next 3 decades. For those Palestinians who hadn't run the risk of staying behind and living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank after the 6 Days War, well, most of them escaped to Jordan. And as a result, Jordan saw a huge influx of Palestinian refugees within its borders after 1967. Even worse, that new population was reporting to Arafat and other Palestinian leaders, not to King Hussein, the leader of the nation of Jordan. So very quickly, this new problem began to emerge as the Palestinians began to form a state within a state among the Jordanians. They had their own militias, the Palestinians did. They had their own government, their own identity, and they refused to obey or accommodate the directives of the Jordanian government. Now, this was particularly troublesome because it positioned King Hussein there in Jordan between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So as Arafat and the Palestinians, they would carry out raids and attacks across the border against Israel from Jordan. Well, the Israeli government threatened King Hussein and the nation of Jordan. If they couldn't bring the Palestinian groups under control, Israel would invade. Meanwhile, any frustrations about the Palestinians voiced by King Hussein, well, that's frowned on by the wider Arab world. They expected him to give the Palestinians a free hand. So before long, this situation was boiling out of control. Arafat and the other Palestinian organizations, they operated almost like a mafia type of collective is the best example or the best icon to kind of put out there. They disrespected, they ignored Jordanian police forces. They harassed Jordanians at large. Now, this was also the heyday of Palestinian political terrorism. Again, you got to notice that this is a political terrorism, not Islamic extremist terrorism. In 1970, you had the terror attacks on the Munich airport. In 1972, the Munich Olympics massacre. An attack on Rome's airport in 1973, the Entebbe hostage crisis in 1976. Whenever you would see these kinds of events, notice that you don't hear about Allah. You don't hear about Islamic fundamentalism. You heard about the Action Organization for the Liberation of Palestine. You heard about the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or Black September, or different political terrorist organizations from among the Palestinians. Now, these were only loosely related to Arafat. He was technically over them, but also technically not over them, right? They had their own leaders. If they participated in actions that benefited Arafat, well, he partook of those benefits. But honestly, he had little control that would enable him to stop them or to make them go into terrorist activity. Now, that's not an excuse for Arafat. During this period, he was certainly a terrorist leader, but suggesting that he realistically could stop Palestinian terrorism altogether, that was a stretch of the imagination, to be real honest. But even as it was blowing back on Arafat and the Palestinians, it was also blowing back on King Hussein in Jordan. Well, things finally came to a head in 1970 with this event known as Black September. That terrorist group that I mentioned just a while ago, they actually took their name from this event right here. And what happened was King Hussein had had enough. He could no longer work with Arafat and the Palestinian organizations in the shape of a state within a state. Some historians record that he even offered Arafat the role of deputy prime minister deputy prime minister of Jordan, in an effort to rein in the Palestinian leader and his collective organizations. But Arafat rebuffed him. Why take an official position within the government when he already wielded real power? In September of 1970, one of the Palestinian terror groups, they hijacked 4 planes and landed them in Jordan. They removed all the passengers, and then they blew up the planes on national TV. And this was humiliating for the Jordanian government. Well, the next day, King Hussein declared martial law, and he initiated a clampdown on Arafat and the Palestinians. Jordan's military inflicted heavy casualties on the Palestinians. The wider Arab world was actually split on what needed to be done here. Some sided with the Palestinians, some with King Hussein in Jordan. Even as the Palestinians suffered greater losses, though, Arafat called for the toppling of Hussein. So that kind of eliminated the world's sympathy, at least from the Arab rulers. By 1971, Arafat and much of the ruling figures of the Palestinian organizations, they had finally been ousted from Jordan. They had been forced into Lebanon, where again, they took up residence. They took with them thousands of Palestinian fighters, all with the primary intent, remember, of inflicting penalties on Israel. Well, for Jordan and Hussein, King Hussein, that's a great relief, obviously. For Israel and the Palestinians, however, the battlefront had merely moved further to the north. We'll come back to that. Now, one of the other major players in the 6 Days War of 1967 was also significantly affected. That's Egypt, right? Now, as I talked about in the last episode, Nasser, he was the most influential figure in the Middle East. The 6 Days War ended all of that. All right. He still retained a lot of influence in Egypt. But after the devastating defeat that year, his influence began to decline rapidly throughout the region of the Middle East. 3 short years later, the famous Egyptian autocrat, Nasser, he died of a heart attack. And into the presidency of Egypt arose Anwar Sadat. Now, Sadat was a contemporary. He was a friend to Nasser. He had actually been among the Free Officers Group that coordinated the Egyptian coup way back in the 1950s. But that's really where the similarities ended, or so people thought. Most observers in 1970 would never have imagined the mark that Sadat, Anwar Sadat, that he would leave not only on the history of Egypt, but frankly the history of the modern Middle East, maybe even the world. At the time, there were rumors that Sadat was a bit of a moron, a little slow in the head. Someone Nasser kept alongside him simply for the easy manipulation, the easy enforcement of Nasser's own will. At the beginning of his presidency, jokes circulated throughout Egypt about Sadat. And they would say one of these jokes told about how Sadat once got into a cab driven by a driver who had also driven Nasser in the past. And Sadat asked repeatedly, he said, where did Nasser go? Where would he have gone if he was driving? What was the direction he take? How did Nasser travel? And he said, are you sure Nasser went this way, not that way? Well, the cab driver reiterates over and over again, yes, this is the way that Nasser went. Well, which way did Nasser go at this turn? The driver said left. Okay, signal left, but go right. That's what Sadat did. You go left, signal left, but go right. I'm going to do it just a little bit differently. That was the legacy of Sadat in the early 70s. But it wasn't one that he would actually leave behind. Now, one critical shift Sadat made compared to Nasser was lightening up on his religious tolerance within Egypt. Nasser had steered Egypt and the Middle East toward a political identity. He had hammered down on religious and Islamic fundamentalism in Egypt, specifically the Muslim Brotherhood. Sadat went a different direction. He didn't change a lot of laws, but he was publicly very devout, very pious during his presidency. So whereas Nasser started his speeches with "my fellow citizens," Sadat started his speeches with Islamic flourishes and encouragement. Far different from Nasser, Sadat began politicizing Islam within Egypt. Now he's going to come to regret this as he really began to unleash a force that he never expected would eventually overwhelm him. I guess what can only be described as a surprise move, not long after Sadat rose to the presidency. Now this is after the death of Nasser. He immediately began extending offers and communications for negotiations to Israel for peace. Now think about that for a minute. The nation that had been the most belligerent towards Israel since 1948 was now extending offers for talks for peace. Well, the only problem is Israel didn't take Sadat seriously. And for that matter, they weren't that interested. The post-1967 environment and feel within the Israeli government was one that can be described as little more than hubris. Now, hubris is exaggerated pride or self-confidence. You usually find it within a political context. Usually it precedes bad things about to happen. No doubt Israel achieved a stunning victory in 1967, but in the early 1970s, the idea that anything beyond victory, beyond dramatic victory at that, well, that was just seen as an alien concept in Israel. Israel was the most powerful nation in the Middle East, and what's more, they were backed by the most powerful military giant in the world, the U.S. So for some time, Israel didn't take Sadat seriously. By 1973, Sadat decided to take a different tactic. Perhaps he could force Israel to the peace table. In 1973, Sadat's Egypt, along with Syria, launched a surprise attack on Israel. The stated aim was to recoup the lost territories of the 6 Days War. The next war in the Israeli-Arab wars was known as the October War among the Arabs, the Yom Kippur War among the Israelis. Probably not coincidentally, it was launched exactly 50 years prior to the day of the Hamas invasion of Israel in October 2023. That's a story for later in the episode, later in this series though. Securing those territories, those lost territories for Egypt and Syria in 1973, that may have been the stated aim, and it may have been a nice benefit. But historically, it appears that Sadat knew that probably wasn't going to happen, wasn't very likely. What he really wanted was to put pressure on Israel to need to talk seriously about peace with Egypt. The 1973 invasion itself came as a total shock to Israel. This was Egypt's surprise invasion, Egypt and Syria. Blinded by their own confidence after the 1967 war, Israel somehow never imagined the Arab powers would attempt such a war again, especially not so soon. So surprised was Israel after the start of the fighting that in the early days of this war, a war that lasted a total of 19 days, Israel found itself actually on the retreat. The Arab armies, for the first time in the history of these Arab-Israeli wars, were actually winning. Now, it's not likely that Egypt or Syria, or both of them together, would have won the war, no matter what happened after this. Israel was just too powerful. And like I said, that probably wasn't Sadat's real objective. But a critical thing occurred during this war. Israel appealed to its new steadfast ally, the U.S. Well, the U.S. responded with what they called Operation Nickelgrass. This was a massive airlift operation of arms and weapons for the Israelis. More than 22,000 tons of material were airlifted and 567 air missions from the U.S. to Israel. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, they feared that a loss for Israel would mean a gain for the Soviet Union in the Middle East. So for 32 days, they flew in new weaponry and supplies for the Israeli military, which the Arab world interpreted as the turning of the tide for this surprise war. Now, this is where the next shock, not only to the Middle East, but to the global system was felt. So frustrated were the Arab states at the U.S. intervention into this war that Saudi Arabia and the oil-producing companies and countries, for the first time, they flexed their muscles in the global economy. The largest oil-producing countries in the world suddenly cut oil exports and sent ripples across the world. The price of gas shot up. Even though the oil embargo lasted only a few months, the global economy was radically shaken, radically transformed. When you look at the history of even popular culture, look at cars that were driven in the 50s and 60s. These huge, like they're almost like tanks, is what most Americans drove during this time, because gas, the price of gas was just considered a non-option. After 1973, they start driving these little bitty cars. Everything starts shifting. The Europeans start driving little bitty cars. Everything shifts after this embargo. Now, looking back, it's easy to laugh at how simple, how unsurprising this move should have been at the time. The price of a gallon of gas before the oil embargo was around 39 cents a gallon in the U.S. After the embargo, it shot up to 53 cents a gallon. Now, that seems like nothing today, but the prices have kept rising ever since this time. And at the same time, it was almost a 50% increase in the price of a gallon of gas. So that changed. Think about living with that reality, a 50% increase in the price of a gallon of gas. That changed the shape, the nature of the global economy. It changed world trade. It set into effect a stagflation effect that would not work its way out of the global economy until the early 1980s. And it drastically altered the shape, the balance of power in the Middle East and throughout the world. After 1973, the world was always afraid of the oil power in the Middle East. The Saudis, meanwhile, already rich, now surged into the class of the mega rich on the global stage. On the ground in Israel and Egypt, the tide had turned in the fighting. So although the United Nations brokered 2 ceasefires, Israel broke both of them and began making advances into Egyptian territory again. By the way, if you want to look at some interesting history, go look at United Nations resolutions regarding Israel. They don't have a very good track record of Israel actually honoring those resolutions. By the time the war was over, Israel forces were within 25 miles of Damascus, 60 miles from Cairo. Now, Israel had won the war again, but this time it was different. This time, their confidence, the Israeli confidence, had been shaken by how off guard the government, the military, had been caught. There was a series of political purges within the military and government of Israel that followed this war, that gave way to a new generation of leadership. The former heroes were punished for their mistakes in 1973. As for Sadat, even though he lost the war, he had achieved his purposes. Israel had the options of war or peace, and now they remembered, oh yeah, peace is a better option in most instances. So for the next few years, Sadat went into overdrive to build relations with the West and with Israel. He visited the U.S. He made friends with the Pope, with Billy Graham. He talked openly about a desire for peace. But now there was a new obstacle that stood in his way. In 1977, Menachem Begin became the new prime minister of Israel, and what amounted to a political revolution, a revolution within the rules, right? Begin was just a radical, of a political radical within Israel, a hardliner Zionist, unlike anyone who had occupied the role of Israel's prime minister before this. He had no interest in peace with Egypt, and that's perhaps why it was so ironic what actually happened next. Throwing caution to the wind, Sadat pulled out all the stops, and in November 1977, he became the first leader of an Arab state to officially visit Israel. He met with Begin. He spoke to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. All the while, he called for aggressive peace efforts between Egypt and Israel. For a region where the leaders of the other Arab states still refused to even recognize Israel, this was a major move by Sadat. Frankly, this is a move that's somewhat underplayed, even in the stories of great men of the 20th century, particularly in the West. This was like a do-or-die move for Sadat. In my mind, you can put Sadat up there alongside men like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. for the way he pushed for peace right here, especially at this juncture. Now, he was no peace activist, but he truly put everything on the line in 1977 and proved to the world he's serious. He's serious about the peace. So this put him on the outs with the other Arab states in the Middle East. Now keep that in mind. Egypt was seen as the leader of those states before 1977. He not only had a lot to lose, but he risked it all for peace between these two countries. Well, Sadat's steps set in motion the Camp David peace talks that included the new U.S. President Jimmy Carter. It also included Begin and, of course, Sadat. That was all done in 1978, and the peace treaty was actually signed in 1979, our famous year that helped shape the modern Middle East that we're looking at in this episode. Sadat and Begin, they each won the Nobel Peace Prize. Sadat, in his acceptance speech, he said, "Let us put an end to wars. Let us shape life on the solid basis of equity and truth." And it is this call which reflected the will of the Egyptian people, of the great majority of the Arab and Israeli peoples, and indeed of millions of men, women, and children around the world that you are today honoring. And these hundreds of millions will judge to what extent every responsible leader in the Middle East has responded to the hopes of mankind. So it was a truly historic thing, what Sadat, particularly what he did, what he accomplished in 1979. But there were problems. For one, Egypt had long been the champion of the Palestinian people. That's gone now, all right? And for many Palestinians, they felt that Sadat had betrayed them. Most of the Arab nations, in fact, felt that Sadat had betrayed the cause, the plight, not only of the Palestinians, but of the wider Middle East. And the years after, it would be learned that Egypt became the second leading recipient of U.S. foreign aid. For decades, Israel and Egypt received more U.S. aid than any other country in the world. And many see the Camp David peace negotiated between Sadat and Begin. They see that as simply the sellout of Sadat to the United States. And it may have been. But in any event, it changed the dynamics of the region. It changed it permanently after this. Now, among those changed dynamics was an increase in polarization across the Middle East. Nations and their leaders, they weren't simply remaining static. They were either moving toward a harder line against the West or a softer line against the West. And the most famous example of this harder line, of course, was in Iran. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution of Iran toppled the Shah. Now, the Shah had been friendly with the West since he first came to power, because he came to power with British and American support during World War II. In the 1950s, the U.S. helped topple the Prime Minister, Mossadegh, in an infamous coup that finally put the Shah on a firm footing in Iran. And the years after that, after this coup in the 1950s, for the next 25 years, in fact, the Shah led the country of Iran really with an iron fist. His Savak, a secret security force, an intelligence service, they were notorious for their brutality throughout Iran. Never again would the Shah allow insurgents and uprisings to threaten his rule. I want to play just this little clip from the show 60 Minutes. This is Mike Wallace interviewing the Shah near the time of him being toppled. And he's talking about Savak, this intelligence service that kept him secure in power through all those years.
We turn to the Shah's secret police force, his FBI and CIA combined. They are called Savak, and they have a reputation for brutality. He acknowledged that he has Savak agents on duty in the United States.
And they are there for the purpose of checking up on Iranian students?
Checking up on anybody who becomes affiliated with circles, organizations hostile to my country, which is the role of any intelligence organization.
And they are there with the knowledge and consent of the United States government?
I think it is.
The deputy director of Savak, a man by the name of Parvis Sabeti, is reported to have castigated the FBI for not keeping a closer watch on Iranian exiles and student groups in the United States. And according to that same report, he says the CIA is no help at all.
He said, oh yes,
he said it. He is also quoted as saying, we'd better not talk about this, but we are fully aware of the situation of Iranian students abroad, especially those working in international communist activities. Mm-hmm. So you do have Savak agents.
Well, I hope so.
In the United States.
I hope everywhere to gather those informations.
Mm-hmm. Now, when an outfit like the International Commission of Jurists comes here and then comes out with a report saying that in spite of what you say, Your Majesty, torture continues.
How do they know? Well, they can't continue saying this. But they have even accused the Great Britain of acting against the human rights.
We're talking for the moment about your country.
They are putting us in the same category.
In other words, you're saying you do what every country does.
Sure.
If torture is necessary, you torture.
Not the torture in the old sense of torturing people, twisting their arms and doing this and that. But there are intelligent ways of questioning now.
Well, they talk about psychological and physical torture.
Physical, I don't believe.
Not
anymore. Maybe in the old days, maybe.
I talked just today to a man whom I believe, who told about torture.
He was tortured?
Yes.
And you believe that he was tortured?
Yes.
How many years ago?
Within, I want to be very careful, not yesterday.
Well, maybe. I don't know.
The word has gone out to stop it.
To stop what?
Torture.
But a long time ago, yes.
How long ago?
Well, I won't tell you, as you don't tell me.
Now, what happened under the Shah's rule, his drive for modernization, for westernization in Iran, it really set him at odds with the Islamic religious establishment of the country, of Iran. From the 1940s until the 1970s, there wasn't a central leader in this opposition. It was just a general consensus among the clerics, the religious thinkers in Iran, that the Shah was leading the nation in the wrong direction. He had the power. Like I said earlier, politics was king in the 1950s and 60s. So since he had the power, nothing changed. Nothing changed for some time. But one of these leaders among the religious opposition was a man by the name of Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini was born in 1900, a student. He was big into poetry, big into philosophy, and of course, he was big into Islamic history and theology. So he became a popular writer, popular teacher after World War II. But it wasn't until the 1960s when he came to be more and more at odds with the Shah of Iran. He gave lectures, he wrote pamphlets, he became increasingly belligerent against the Shah until finally, in 1964, he was exiled from Iran. So he spent most of that time in Iraq, next door to Iran, during those exile years. He held up there between 1964 and 1978, and during that time, his stature among Iranians, specifically revolutionaries and the hardliners, his stature grew. Long before social media, long before YouTube, the technology of cassette tapes became a big influencer in the 1970s. And Khomeini, he would record a speech or a lecture, and then it would be smuggled into Iran through cassette tapes. Then duplicates would be made, and it would spread like wildfire throughout the country. So the more corrupt and hard-handed the Shah became, the more popular Khomeini and other opposition leaders they became. Khomeini was one of several leading opposition figures. There were communist groups. There were other Islamic leaders, even pro-democracy groups. The only thing they all held in common was opposition to the Shah, and opposition to the U.S., by the way, who was seen as friend to the Shah, as you can hear in that clip that I just played. The U.S. helped keep the Shah in power, and of course, ultimately, they were seen as the U.S. was seen as an imperial presence within the country of Iran. So during the 1970s, corruption, mismanagement by the Shah within Iran became more and more apparent. So as a result, he felt more and more threatened by this variety of voices among his political opponents. He felt more threatened, and when he felt threatened, he clamped down harder on the opposition. And well, that kind of just added fuel to the fire in Iran by this time. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 is seen historically as one of the big misses of Western and U.S. intelligence services like the CIA. They should have seen it coming, but they totally missed it. State visits from major leaders and dignitaries within the U.S. establishment, they often observed clampdowns. They observed protests, even killings at times, on Iranian streets within the build-up to 1979. But at every turn, it was explained away. It was minimized so that what came in 79 was a total shock to the Western world. Now, part of that shock was because the Shah himself was keeping secrets. He had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Distracted and afraid, he failed to inform even his allies and his enemies. They only grew in power during this time. In 1978, Saddam Hussein, the new leader of Iraq next door, he was fed up with Khomeini's rhetoric and the call to arms against the Shah. But he was so fed up that Hussein actually exiled Khomeini from Iraq. So to that end, Hussein exiled Khomeini as well, and he sent him to Paris. Now, this is another important event that occurred in the story of Khomeini, one that's often repeated in the West. The Western world in 1978 kind of fell in love with Khomeini. You don't hear about that today. He was featured on magazine covers, on news programs. He was hailed as a freedom fighter and lifted up like some kind of Che Guevara figure. The West, particularly the media, they often make this mistake over and over again. They look to the Middle East and impose their own values, their own vision of what's happening there. The media saw democracy and human rights on the person of Khomeini and his growing popularity. They had no idea what was about to follow. In January 1979, as unrest grew in the streets of Iran, the Shah actually flew out of the country. Now, perhaps he believed he would return when things died down. He had done that before, for example, during the coup of the 1950s, but he's not going to come back this time. He would actually die in exile. 2 weeks later, Khomeini made a triumphant re-entry into Iran aboard a flight from Paris. The reporter Peter Jennings, along with more than 100 other reporters, they were with him on the plane trying to record this historical moment. Time magazine held Khomeini as the man of the year that year in 1979. And for the Western media, the return of Khomeini from exile to Iran was a day of victory for human rights, for freedom. Again, they had no idea what was about to happen. Keep this in mind, just as a side note, keep this in mind in our story of the 6 years that made the modern Middle East. The Western media usually gets it wrong, particularly the Western media that came of age after the 1960s. We'll see this time and time again, all the way up to the present and the story going forward. But most people had no idea what was coming in Iran. Yasser Arafat became one of the first Arab notables to visit Iran after Khomeini came to power. Arafat and many others in the world of the Middle East, they envisioned a new day of freedom, a new day of power for the oppressed peoples of the Middle East. They kind of had this idea, something like Fidel Castro's takeover of Cuba in the late 1950s, early 60s. This would be the starting point of revolution in the Middle East. The next stop would be Jerusalem, then Palestine. Different revolutionary groups throughout the Middle East at first paid homage to Khomeini. They thought this was the beginning of something. Well, it didn't take long for them to realize Khomeini had something different in mind than what they hoped for. Revolutions are always bloody, disordered affairs. From the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution, revolutions are dangerous for human life. The 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, it was no different. It wasn't the Islamic Revolution at first, in fact. It was simply the revolution. As Khomeini and his forces grew in influence and power, they tactfully consolidated their forces and supporters to bring Khomeini to the top of the pile. And within a year's time, it was the Islamic Revolution by that time, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. This was a victory for Allah, not just for Khomeini. Soon, Khomeini outlawed the use of the term democratic in reference to their revolution. That's what a Western concept was, not what he or the Islamic Revolution in Iran was all about. Clampdowns on the universities, on the wider education system, they were initiated. The purges quickly began. First, it was the loyalists that had supported the Shah over the last 2.5 decades. Then it was the communists. Then it was anyone and everyone who opposed Khomeini. Then it was the people of Iran themselves. And for the next decade, Khomeini's reign of terror washed over Iran. Tens of thousands were arrested. It's difficult to know really how many were killed during this time. Some say the number was higher than tens of thousands. On the streets of major cities like Tehran, opponents of Khomeini were found hanging from construction cranes, just out there in the open, their bodies a warning to anyone who opposed the new theocratic fundamentalist rule of Khomeini in Iran. Executions were often carried out after speedy makeshift trials with charges of corrupting the earth or enmity against Allah. The veil and new social rules transformed the country. Once the most westernized and liberal nation of the Middle East, torture and arbitrary detention became commonplace in Iranian cities. Opposition newspapers were shut down. Iran, once the key pillar of U.S. geopolitical interest in the Middle East, now became a pariah. After the U.S. refused to return the dying Shah to Iran to stand trial before Khomeini's new system of Islamic justice, Iranian protesters took over the U.S. embassy in Tehran. They held 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage for 444 days. They weren't released until President Carter was out of office, literally during the inauguration of President Ronald Reagan. The Islamic Revolution, 1979, changed more than relations between Iran and the U.S., though. It changed the shape of the modern Middle East. And the year 1979 was pivotal because, well, frankly, there was just a great loss of hope and vision in the Middle East. The political hopes of citizens from Palestine to Lebanon, Iraq to Iran, and Egypt to Saudi Arabia, they collapsed. The holdouts who believed that a political solution existed for their Arab identity and the Middle East conundrums, they finally gave up hope in 1979. It didn't happen suddenly, even though it felt like all of a sudden in 1979. This had been building for decades. In the 1920s, there was this Egyptian Islamic scholar. He helped found the Muslim Brotherhood. Their biggest claim to fame, the Muslim Brotherhoods, their biggest claim to fame was being one of the most aggressive and successful fighting units in the 1948 Israeli-Arab War. At a time when Arab nations were vying for self-determination and independence, the Muslim Brotherhood was pushing for an Arab identity rooted to Islamic law, not politics. They were a fringe group, though, at that time, in the 1940s, the 1950s. They weren't significant influencers on the stage that was making the modern Middle East during those decades. In the 50s and 60s, this guy, Sayyid Qutb, a leading member of the Muslim Brotherhood, he was among the most outspoken voices for a return to Islam as the cure of the problems of the Arab world, the wider Middle East. Qutb published around 30 books, but arguably his most influential was the book Milestones. He pushed for an aggressive, politicized vision of Islam that was both offensive and defensive in the culture. Rather than just the choice between democracy or communism, the Arab world, according to Qutb, he wanted to return to the Quran, to Sharia law. An influential voice within Egypt, he was clearly at odds with Nasser during the peak of Nasser's influence and power. So in 1966, he was actually executed. He was hung for his role in an assassination plot against Nasser that year. So the death of Qutb, it elevated him to the status of martyr among Muslims in the Middle East. At that time, the Arab states were humiliated during the 6 Days War, and now you've got this martyr, Qutb. Well, many Muslims in the Middle East were beginning to suspect that they and their culture, maybe they had gone astray. Democracy and communism had not delivered the promised dreams that they were told about. Neither had nationalism. Perhaps Allah was punishing them for straying from the Quran. Voices like Khomeini leveraged this sentiment. He rode it to victory in Iran. Even as Sadat in Egypt referred to Khomeini as the crazy cleric, others in the Middle East were wondering if perhaps the success of Khomeini's Islamic Revolution in Iran, maybe it wasn't just a coincidence, but a divine strategy from Allah to reshape the Middle East. Politics wasn't working. Maybe political Islam would. So in Saudi Arabia, even as the bank accounts and the treasuries overflowed with new wealth following the oil embargo of 1973, many Muslims noted the clear corruption, the clear wicked lifestyles of the ruling Saudi family, the House of Saud. So although they had been entrusted to guard the holy Muslim cities of Mecca and Medina, the Saudi family, they were viewed as Western-loving, worldly monarchs. So the family, once aligned to a puritanical school of Islam known as Wahhabism. Well, now they were just aligned to the treasures of the West. That was the way a lot of their constituents, a lot of the people they ruled over, how they saw the Saudi family. So in 1979, another shocking event unfolded at the Grand Mosque of Mecca. This is the place where Muslims are required to visit at some point in their lifetime to offer prayers. That's according to the 5 pillars of Islam. So millions of Muslims visit the mosque every year. In November 1979, this man by the name of Juhayman al-Utabi and a group of his followers, they took over the Grand Mosque. And having taken over the Grand Mosque, Utabi demanded the immediate abdication of the Saudi royal family, the expulsion of all foreigners from Mecca, and the restoration of pure Islam to Saudi Arabia and the Muslim world. Khomeini, over in Iran, he praised Utabi, which the rest of the Muslim world, they just stood in shock. For 15 days, the Saudis laid siege to the Grand Mosque, finally killing Utabi, regaining control. But the warning had been made clear. The U.S. and Western money, Western aid, it wasn't going to give them the power, the influence on the world stage that was only usable if they could hold on to power in their own country. A madman like Khomeini in Iran, he risked ruining all of that. He and his new Islamic Republic of Iran became a competitor for the true defender of Islam. And so the Saudis, they had to once again reprove their bona fides to the Islamic world. Now, the timing of these fears, these revelations, coincided with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. And so, like we said, the pivotal year in the history of the making of the modern Middle East. The invasion of Afghanistan, this presented the opportunity that the Saudis were looking for. The atheist Soviet communist had invaded a sovereign Muslim nation. The U.S. hoped Afghanistan would be the Soviet Union's Vietnam. They partnered with the Saudis. The U.S. and the Saudis sponsored an Islamic holy war in Afghanistan against the Soviets for the next decade. The Saudis became huge financial and ideological sponsors of the war in Afghanistan. Muslims from around the world used Saudi money to get to the war-torn nation in Central Asia and wage jihad against the Soviets. In the 1980s, the 1990s, I was actively involved in a Christian organization that helped get Bibles to persecuted churches in the communist world. Years later, as I learned about Afghanistan and the U.S. and Saudi efforts there, I was shocked to discover that at the same time the U.S. was financing the printing of millions of Qurans that were used to help radicalize Muslims for jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Now, this is where men like Osama bin Laden and many, many others headed to during the 1980s. This was the holy call for a generation of Muslims in the Middle East, and it helped radicalize a whole school of thought. And all of that, as we've seen, started in 1979, in this year that radically altered the shape of the modern Middle East. Now, the radicalism would spread throughout the Middle East. In many ways, the Saudis and the new Islamic Republic of Iran, they were competing for leadership and the new extremist vision of Islam. The political vision of the Middle East was dead by 1979, or at least by the end of 1979. Now the Middle East would be a radicalized vision of Islam, propagated throughout the world with Saudi oil wealth and Iranian revolutionary extremism. For many in the Western world, this is the vision of the Middle East we came of age under. We got to realize, though, that it was different before this. Like I said, look at the names of the terror groups. Look at the names of the organizations within the Middle East at the beginning of the 1970s. They were all political in nature, but by the beginning of the 1980s, that all changed. Almost all of them identified themselves religiously. And that shift was not accidental. It was not merely the result of poverty and corruption and authoritarianism. All of those things played a part in the shift, but the move to Islamic extremism by 1979 was an ideological move. Militant Islam positioned itself as a unique answer to the problems of the world. It wasn't only desperation. It was also about influence, about identity and power, and all of those things became viable within Islamic extremism because politics had failed. And the U.S. helped push this. U.S. policy and the CIA pushed extremism from the Saudis directly with arms and financing in places like Afghanistan. According to U.S. policymakers, this would, in turn, bind the Saudis and their oil wealth, their oil interest. It would bind them closer to U.S. interest, even while it turned them and their wealth against the Soviets. The U.S. policymakers never imagined it would one day backfire and turn against them. And of course, indirectly, the U.S. and Israel also helped promote extremism in Iran as well. Their actions in places like Lebanon helped fuel Iranian and Middle Eastern resentment against the U.S. and Israel. Abandoned by Egypt, Iran stepped into the vacuum to be the new voice of anti-imperialism in the Middle East. Lebanon's dysfunctional state finally collapsed into civil war by the middle of the 1970s. Remember, the whole structure of the Lebanese state had been deliberately designed by the French during the Mandate years, before World War II. And then with independence afterwards, it had been designed for failure. But by the 1970s, the French, they weren't as interested in Lebanon's Christians or its people. And so the civil war took shape in Lebanon. The nation's never been the same, not since then. It's rolled from one conflict to another, one crisis to another, until today, Lebanon is truly in the category of failed state status. The one-time Paris of the Middle East, now a failed state. If you remember from the start of this episode, I talked about the Palestinians and their leadership expulsion from Jordan. By the end of the 1970s, they had settled into Lebanon. The decade of the 70s likely represented the low point history for the Palestinians. Torn from their homes in 1948, then again in 1967, many of them still carried the deeds, the literal paper copies of the deeds to their lands and their homes that Israel had demolished and planted settlers on after the wars of those years. But worse than that, the leaders of the Palestinians in the first half of the 1970s had made their names, the names of the Palestinian people, synonymous with political terrorism. It's going to get worse. In Lebanon, once again, Arafat and the Palestinian organizations operated as a state within a state in the war-torn, collapsing nation. Not only terrorists, but here Palestinians were seen as thugs, as unwelcome guests. It seemed this happened wherever they went. So as the Palestinians launched terror attacks from Lebanon and into the north of Israel, this served once again as the grounds for the next Israeli war.
Israeli armor started crossing the border just before midnight. The operation covered the whole of the 75-mile-long frontier from the Mediterranean to the foot of Mount Hermon. The armor went in 6 spearheads with full support units, an operation involving an undisclosed but considerable number of men. All the time, the Israelis were stressing that they were doing all they could to avoid civilian casualties.
With Egypt subdued through peace treaties in the south, Israel's military invaded Lebanon in the late 1970s in the north, again in the early 1980s. Now, the military victory for Israel would be simple, as usual. But the fallout from that invasion was a debacle, as Arafat and the Palestinian leadership were once again exiled from another nation. The U.S. and Israel promised safety for the Palestinian refugees left behind. Well, instead, the U.S. left Israel in charge, and Lebanese militias invaded the refugee camps and carried out infamous massacres in Sabra and Shatila. Now, the horrors of those acts that unfolded there echoed across the Middle East, justifying every Islamic extremist in their mind and proving their points for American and Israeli imperialism and atrocity once again. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Sadat, seeing the extremism of Khomeini in Iran, refusing to embrace the fundamentalism among the Saudis, he decided it was time to start changing his own tactics. Having lightened the grips on Islamic groups in Egypt during the 1970s, well, now he changed course, and he began to clamp down once again. He frequently derided activities of the Saudis and the Khomeinis of the Middle East, which included any other Islamic extremists in his mind. Unfortunately, Sadat found it much harder to put the genie back in its bottle. Having encouraged, or at least partially encouraged, the role of Islam as the cure and answer for what ailed the people of the Middle East and of Egypt, they weren't going to believe the traitor who had made peace with Israel and abandoned the Palestinians. They weren't going to believe him anymore. So in 1981, while watching a military parade in Cairo that celebrated the early victories of the October War in 1979, jets flew overhead, and the crowd, they all looked up. And while they looked skyward, a truck full of assassins unloaded from within the parade. They ran towards Sadat. Sadat thought the soldiers were coming to salute him. He stood to receive their salute, and instead they threw hand grenades, unloaded rounds of ammo into Sadat. 10 people were killed in all, including the president of Egypt, the man who had won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts with Israel, fell dead.
I should like them to write on my tomb, he has lived for peace and he has died for principles.
Anwar Sadat, peacemaker of Egypt, killed in a military assassination.
In the wake of that assassination, Hosni Mubarak, also shot during the assassination. He was next to or nearby Sadat. Well, Mubarak became the new president. Now, he would rule as a dictator in Egypt for the next 3 decades. And a nationwide manhunt followed to hunt down all involved in this conspiracy to kill Sadat. Those directly involved were executed by firing squad, by hanging. But even more were imprisoned. They were tortured. These were those among the leading voices of Islamic fundamentalism, anti-Zionism, anti-Americanism. In the crackdown that followed the assassination of Sadat, there's this haunting video of jail cells in Egypt, packed, overflowing with young Arab men. These are the Islamic fundamentalists gathered up in the aftermath of the assassination. One of the men, he rails at the cameras filming them. He has horn-rimmed glasses. He's wearing a beard. He wails about the torture that they've endured, the inhumane treatment by the Egyptian security forces. He's not identified at that time as anyone of significance, anyone in particular. But this young man would become known as Ayman al-Zawahiri, the second in command of al-Qaeda under Osama bin Laden.
We have suffered in these past 14 months the severest forms of humiliation and torture in the dirty Egyptian jails, in the horrible prison of Al-Qara, and the prison of Tura, and the prison of Al-Istiqbal, and the prison of Al-Marj, where we suffered the severest inhuman treatment. There, they kicked us, they beated us, they whipped us with the electric cables, they shocked us with electricity, and they used there the wild dogs, and they hanged us over the edges of the doors with our hand tied at the back. They arrested the wives, the mothers, the fathers, the sisters, and the sons in a trial to put a psychological press over these innocent prisoners.
That guy's rants and raves, as well as the torture he endured, they're all part of the story that would tell the future of the next 20 years of the history of the modern Middle East. He and his peers would change the world of the modern Middle East once again. Now, this is the shape of the modern Middle East as the 1970s closed and the 1980s opened. 1979 was the next big year that shaped the modern Middle East that we know today. It was never a region of the world that was always stuck in warfare like most of us have been led to believe. It was a region that was sabotaged from the very beginning. Well, in 1979, this year, the name of God was used to warp and to dysfunctionalize the region. In our next episode, we're going to turn to the next year that we look at in this series of the history of the modern Middle East. That year will be 2003. And that's the year that the U.S. invaded Iraq. And a whole new level of chaos and a whole new level of turmoil was poured into the region. That's coming next time on this podcast series, the 6 years that shaped the modern Middle East.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.